Michael, I really want to say a big thank you for making time to talk to me. As you know, we've been worrying about the issues of carbon emissions and the aviation industry for some time. And one of the things that you've helped me to understand is just how much waste there is, how much fuel is being burnt that doesn't need to be burnt. And of course, all that fuel that's burnt is pumping out carbon into the atmosphere. And as I understand it, and you're going to explain in great detail, I know, in a minute, but as I understand it, the aviation industry could make significant savings right now in the amount of carbon emissions which are coming out of the back of their aircraft just by running the whole system more efficiently. Just as we expect now manufacturers to run their factories efficiently, surely that's something reasonable to expect of the aviation industry. So Michael Baiada, thank you very much for making time to talk to me today, particularly since it's the day before New Year's Eve. But I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Well, thank you, Harold. I appreciate the opportunity to chat about this. This is an important subject, as you said, not only for England, Heathrow, but around the world. The amount of CO2 and NOx that we pump into the atmosphere unnecessarily from an aviation perspective is just, to me, unnecessary, as I said. What I'd like to do is kind of go through some of the issues here. And let me first start off by saying, I'm not a Heathrow expert, right? I haven't done the analysis of Heathrow, but having flown in there as a 747 captain and Boeing 777 captain numerous times, I have not found it any different than any other airport that I've flown into. They're all about the same. Yes, some are more crowded, but to be honest, none of them are full. Now, I know that goes against everything people believe, but what we have is point overloads, not full. And I'll explain that as we go through that. So the first thing I wanted to do is determine let me see if I can move this up here out of the way, what the problem is and what the basic information about Heathrow that I can understand and make sure I'm on the right page. It took me a while. I was really surprised how difficult getting and gathering the data is for Heathrow. And I'm just not familiar with all the websites there as I am here in the United States. But I look at this and I found the 2005 through 2020, November of 2020 data. And then I had to go through 4 or 5 different websites and manually compile this list. So I'll put the caveat in there. I think it's accurate, but and it looks accurate from what I know in other airports. But you can see that the hourly average arrivals, that fourth column over, is fairly consistent for the last 15 years. We started 36.14 and up till 2019 had 36.47 average landings per hour during the uncurfewed time from 6 a.m. in the morning to 11:30 a.m. at night. And then you get another 16 or so landings that are allowed during the night. So I looked at that and I was surprised that not only was it very narrow, and you can see the percent change in the next column, but since 2011, 2012 time frame, the actual arrival rate has been going down. And you can see that's had little impact actually on the percentage of on-time performance. Like 2011 with 39.64 arrivals per hour average, it was 83.9. Now that's April. As I said, I had a real difficult time looking and finding the data. So I only did April as opposed to the whole year in terms of on-time performance. And I did that also because in 2020, the time frame, April, was the lowest arrival rate. They had 4,000 arrivals for the whole month. That's not a lot of arrivals for an airport like Heathrow when you're having, upwards of 20,000 arrivals a day. And even in April, the on-time arrival, with that low a capacity, a demand rather, you would think would go down significantly, go up significantly rather. But it didn't. It stayed in that high 70s, low 80s time frame percentage of on-time performance. Now, the average delay minutes went down to somewhere around 6 from kind of an average of around 11 to 12. So that was a good thing. But the on-time performance, which is another metric, just didn't happen. One of the issues that I look at is what's really going on here. This is an arrival rate I pulled off of, I think, the NATS website going into London. And you can see these are westerly arrivals where the airplanes come in, they come from the stacks, and then they go out varying distances from the airport, which we call final approach, and then turn in and land. So if you're this guy here, you have a long time to get to the airport. If you, this guy in here, you have a short time to get to the airport. Well, you really, all this in here is just waste and inefficiency that doesn't need to happen. And along with that inefficiency is CO2, NOx, noise, all this area underlying here, you're at a fairly low altitude, creating significant amount of noise, which has its own issues going forward.
So Michael, just to be clear, what I'm looking at here is the approach paths coming in from Weybridge and then turning to come out and go out through to Heathrow down the main approach lines.
Yes, that's it. So typically an airplane will come in, and in the Heathrow case, they have stacks north and south of the runway and northeast and southeast of the runway that the airplanes wait in, again, burning more fuel, creating more CO2. And then when it's their time, ATC will line them up into these green tracks. And I'm assuming this looks like about 24 hours, but again, it was hard to find the picture to begin with, let alone exactly what time frame it portrays. So the bottom line is here, all the airplanes should basically turn in somewhere around the L of the London, okay? This out here is inefficiency and what manufacturing call work in process inventory, which is very, very expensive. So ATC and airlines focus on this, but this is what they really need to solve. And this is this different perspective. This is the on-time performance of 4 big airlines here in the US, American, Delta, United, 3 airlines rather, and shows the high variation day to day over about 6 to 8 months worth of, 11 months worth of data. And you can see one day they're early, the next day they're late. They're all over the place in terms of the arrival. Now, this impacts the air traffic control system in the local terminal London area, because sometimes they have very little traffic. Sometimes they have way too much traffic. And when you overload the system, that's when you have to get into your stacking. So this variance is a real critical issue that we in aviation have really not paid attention to. So this whole solution requires a different perspective. This is actually a standard queuing theory model. It's actually a manufacturing plant, simulation of a manufacturing plant. And you can see the more variation, which are the upward sweeping lines, the more time in queue, which is the vertical axis on the left there, and the bottom horizontal axis is utilization. And you can see as you approach you approach maximum capacity, the 1.0 here, the more variation you put into the system, the more time in queue you add to the system. So if I come into an airport like Heathrow and I'm down in this area, lower variation, what happens is my time in queue is very small. But as I get up in this area where we operate in these more busier airports, Newark, London, Frankfurt, etc., the time in queue raises exponentially. So understanding this chart is critical to understanding what's going on at London. It's the point overloads that are highly variant that puts you up here, that increases your time in queue, which relates to how long you stay in the stack, how far you go out from the airport before you're allowed to turn back in. Here's a pretty clear picture of what a lot of people say of variation. Jack Welch, who was the head of GE for many, many years, well renowned. He's obviously retired. I think he's passed away as well. But the end result is his concept is variation is evil. And if you read through this concept of variation, it really kind of hits home in terms of what variation does: bad quality, unreliability, nasty surprises. And the bottom one is from a customer perspective. Customers feel variation. They don't care that your average on-time arrival of the A14 on time plus 14 minutes is 80%. What they care about is their flight was 45 minutes late today and they missed their connection to their next thing. So they feel the variation, they don't feel the averages, right? So what does this do to the airline operation? We see what it does to air traffic control on that first slide of the London arrivals. But this is what happens, and this is well borne out in the DOT, the Department of Transportation data here in the United States, is that as the day goes on, the variation basically continues to delay. So the worse it gets, the worse it gets. So if I push out from the gate 5 minutes late, I'm now 3 more aircraft in front of me in queue. Now, so I'm taking off later. Because I'm taking off later, I'm 6 more airplanes that are landing in front of me in queue at my destination, and it just gets worse and worse. And then what the airlines do is use the overnight to basically draw that back down and get back to some normal semblance of on-time performance. But the bottom line is, even overnight, you're still starting at about a 5% defect rate, delay rate. So you have a huge, this variation has a huge impact both on ATC, who has to deal with lots of things that they shouldn't have to deal with, the CO2, the noise, the NOx, but it also has a huge impact on the airline in terms of its operation at the ramp and et cetera. The airline answer to all this, which is very expensive, is to add block time. So in other words, rather than attack the delays and the inefficiencies in the system, they just make the production time from A to B longer. So effectively, over the last 30, 40 years, we've added upwards of 20 minutes of schedule time in every flight on average. And this is the only analysis I could find, and this only goes to 2006. This is not something, again, people measure, but this is critical because if you continually to add block time, if you take longer and longer to produce a product, I don't care if it's widgets or passengers at the destination curb, it becomes more and more expensive. So if an airline chose to figure this out and solve it, which they can, the solution exists, they would have a huge competitive advantage. And to put that in perspective, that last statement at the bottom from Southwest Airlines, it costs approximately 8 to 10 aircraft if they add 2 minutes to their schedules. Well, we're upwards of 20 minutes to their schedules total in the air and on the ground, somewhere in that neighborhood. That means 80 to 100 aircraft of an airline is flying around simply to manage the inefficiencies that the airlines allow to infect their operation day in and day out. Now, think about what that means in terms of CO2, what that means in terms of NOx, what that means in terms of noise, because not only does the airline have to pay for all this, the ATC has to deal with these airplanes, which gets you into stacking and other issues. This is another picture. I believe this is a simulation of the London area arrivals. And the 4 stacks that I outlined are the ones that feed London. There's other stacks and other arrival flows in this picture, but this looks really complex. But what we're trying to solve is the problem here in the last 200 to 300 miles. As opposed to defect prevention, we're working on defect correction. Oh, I have too many airplanes, want to go to London. Let's stack them up over Bovington or Ockham, and then we'll take them, pull them in at the top of the stack and let them rotate down the stack. And then once they get to the bottom, we'll put them in queue and run them out as that first slide showed into a long downwind and final. As I said, though, no airport I've ever landed in is full. And let people kind of think about that for a while, because that's, again, a critical, along with variation, is this concept. I don't care if you're landing in London, Newark, LaGuardia, Chicago, or Boise. If you try and make two aircraft land at the same time, you have a delay. So fixing this is not as hard as it seems if you go into defect prevention, as opposed to what you see here in stacking and all the other things is defect correction. Once you have a problem, it's very expensive to fix it. If you can identify the problem early on and make it go away, it becomes much, much easier for air traffic control, for everybody going forward. Of course, how do you do that, right? How do you fix it in real time? And all of my solution is day of. This isn't about schedules. All the schedules are fine. All demand is fine. Capacity is typically fine across the world into current operation. So if you look at this top row, what you see is a random arrival flow into an airport. What air traffic control does is take the first one, leave it alone, second one, move it back, third, fourth. So you can see you de-peak the queue, this very timing queue, backwards in time. This is what eats you in terms of delays, and also CO2 and NOx and noise. So these two arrival slots, which go unused. What happens is, if you can identify this, understand that row 2 will happen if you do nothing, well, let's do something about it. So the third row says, let me look at this flow and not only move it forward, but let's move it forward in a business-like manner. So flight number 4 here, which is here, ends up slightly backwards in the do nothing queue, but I'm going to make it go as fast as it can to put it at the front of the queue. But I look and I see airplanes 1 and 2, which are early. Now, if I leave them alone, they're here. If I slow them down behind 4, they just build the queue backwards behind them. So even though these may be early, I'm going to pull them forward from a business perspective, but I've got to mesh that with all my ground assets. Do I have gates? Do I have other aspects? Which airplanes do I pull forward, even if they're early, which actually makes them slightly less efficient, but it makes this whole queue much more efficient. For example, as I think I mentioned last time we talked, if you have 30 airplanes in this queue up here at the top, and you just take the first 2 airplanes and pull them off the front end of the queue a couple minutes each, you didn't save 2 minutes. You saved 2 times every airplane in the queue behind. You just took somewhere around 60 minutes of flying time and CO2 and NOx and noise out of the system by just moving these first 2 airplanes forward. Now, let's go back in the queue and move late ones forward, early ones back, and you have a much, much more efficient operation. Of course, most people will tell you that we just don't have the capacity to do that. Well, here's a picture of Newark. This is July of 2019. Obviously, this year is not representative. And this line, black line here, is the number of arrivals that air traffic control says the airport can take. The red and black are in the air or landed. The green are scheduled to come in the future. So all this green is in the future. What happens is, you can see this tall green line here and the 2 slots next to it. These are 15-minute blocks. ATC will get this in that last 200 miles, this picture here, and de-peak it backwards in time. It'll use delay, i.e. defect correction, to make them fit. So if you're always taking these peaks and moving them to the right, that's all delay. And it makes ATC's job much, much harder. Well, if I could, like in this picture, take these and identify which airplanes are at the beginning of the queue, which airplanes are late, which airplanes are early, and move them into this opening here, and do this consistently, where you move this group here, this group here, this group forward, and maybe even 2 slots ahead, because you made this green lower, there's plenty of capacity. And this picture, it's good weather, obviously, it's as opposed to bad weather. But even in bad weather, the same applies. Well, the lines are much closer to the capacity, this black line, but at the end of the day, there's still available capacity going forward. So what does that mean in terms of benefits? My partner, Lonnie Boland, did an analysis at GreenLandings.org. It's a nonprofit he's working on to provide this type of data to users. But I did an analysis, and using 650 arrivals a day at Heathrow, I ran it through his calculation, and this is the monthly tonnage of CO2 that you can reduce. I actually think this is fairly conservative. I think you could probably get at least double this. And you can see it starts at month 9, because the first implementation, like at a Heathrow, is going to be about 9 months. Then there's a little bit of time kind of getting up to speed, and a little more time before you get up to your maximum benefit in this calculation. So this is a lot of CO2 that we're just pumping into the atmosphere that is unnecessary and can be resolved. I mean, that's the real message here, is this solution to make this a reality exists right now today. Tested by FAA, validated by FAA, Embry-Riddle, GE Aviation, and others. Unfortunately, it's not what we do, right? This is what we do, is try and solve this, right? That defect correction. What we need to do is solve this, where is it here? This, right? We have to flatten this curve out, move these average lines way up. And the airlines could do that if we chose, in conjunction with air traffic control, but you can't do it here. You've got to do it hours prior to landing. And that's how you make this a reality. This is the noise reduction in decibels. Again, just the stair step going up, basically 9 months to put it in, and then some time to, get everybody on board. Again, congestion. Congestion is just point overloads that if you can move the queue forward and flatten the queue 2, 3, 4 hours prior to landing, which is entirely not only possible, we've actually done it at numerous airports around the world, Atlanta, Detroit, Minneapolis, Dubai, etc. And for significant benefit financially to the airline, but also to the environment. So that these are calculated. This is an analysis. This is not this is more like a simulation. This is real world. This is 8 years of operations at Atlanta with GreenLandings, that you can see gallons of fuel saved 30 million, 634 million pounds of CO2 that was not produced and gone into the atmosphere. And this happens over and over and over again. And again, these numbers are actually conservative. The analysis that FAA and Embry-Riddle University did are even more higher than these numbers in terms of calculation. So let's, again, that's one place. Let's go to Dubai. This is, again, GE Aviation did the analysis. This was 25,000 kilograms a day in fuel reduction. And you do the calculation out, and that's, again, significant amount of CO2 that was not produced in the air. And then look at the other benefits. Almost 3 minutes of less flight time. A0 and A14, these are on-time statistics, went up. So the bottom line, everything gets better going forward. This is kind of a summary, and the reader can read through this while I talk, but the bottom line is this solution is available today. It could be implemented at Heathrow, Gatwick, wherever within 9 months, probably a little bit less. The second and third implementation would be shorter, and you could do all of Europe in about 3 years. Now, it's an aggressive schedule and will require commitment, but you're looking at $25 to $50 million over a 3-year period to dramatically reduce CO2 and congestion and delays that could be in place, as I said, starting within months. Well proven. It's also interesting that the ROI for this, the return on investment by an investor like an airline, is measured in months, if not weeks. So you're talking, again, not an expensive solution going forward. The end bullet here is very important, right? One of the things is we try and solve the local problem around Heathrow is it takes new equipment and lots of big expenditures going forward, literally hundreds of billions of dollars. And if you look at this solution that has been worked on for the last 40 years that I've been involved in airline operations and air traffic control, the end result is that the solution has been 10 years and $100 billion into the future. That was true in 1980, is true in 1990, 2000, 2010, and is still true today. So what we're doing isn't getting the job done, especially if you go back and look at the Heathrow arrival rate. It's gotten worse, not better, and it hasn't really changed a whole lot in 15 years. We need significant improvement in throughput of Heathrow, and I'm talking 2, 3, 4 arrivals an hour, which is a big step going forward, and the reduction of CO2, the reduction of noise, the reduction of congestion. It makes air traffic controls jobs easier and less costly if you go through. And that last bullet really hits home. It requires no new avionics in the aircraft, no new airborne equipment or ground equipment, and most importantly, no new air traffic control procedures, which are very expensive and very time consuming to develop. So the end result is this is something that can be in place quickly, well proven, and start reducing CO2 and noise and NOx until we get to the point of whether it's biofuels or other longer term technological solutions years into the future. We could save a lot of money, fuel, CO2, et cetera, very quickly if we chose to move forward. And I did put just the contact information here that if anybody would like to understand how to do this better, because there's always questions. It's what I call the it can't be done's. Many people I talk to, well, that can't be done because it's weather, it's air traffic control won't let you. Actually, air traffic control, this makes their job easier and doesn't infringe on any of what they do today because it's happening 2, 3, 4 hours prior to landing. It's that defect prevention that allows air traffic control to get the right part at the right place at the right time to limit the point overload at the airport, i.e. Heathrow. So that's kind of it. Any questions?
Michael, let me just try and make sure I've understood this correctly. What you've described is a very substantial amount of environmentally damaging waste, whether that's carbon dioxide or nitrous oxides or noise. It's all polluting waste, basically.
Yes.
The question that I'm left with in my mind is that clearly waste happens, I guess, for one or two reasons. Either the cost of the thing that's being wasted isn't sufficiently high to make you want to look after it. But you've demonstrated there are major cash savings for companies in this, and they all claim that they're in a highly competitive situation and they need to save every penny they can, and yet the waste happens. So the question in my mind is, clearly the market has not made airlines pay attention to this. Perhaps they don't pay enough for the pollution they cause, and that might cause them to pay more attention. So you might argue that this is a good example of why you should tax the polluter. But the bigger question for me that kind of sits in front of that, it's easier, isn't it, for the airlines to blame air traffic control, talk about the reorganization as they do of the European skies. But in reality, it seems to me, ATC can't force the airlines to run their businesses more efficiently. So who can make the change?
Well, this is the problem with this is the lack of vision and leadership moving forward, right? And that really gets into it. At the airline, you don't have what I call a vice president of production. If you go to a Toyota or General Motors plant or a Jaguar plant, they have somebody who is absolutely responsible to get the cars out the door, right? So if they're supposed to build, 1,000 cars a day, and they're only building 800, and two factories over, they're building 1,000. That plant manager, that vice president of production, is going to get the boot, right? And so, but they don't have anybody responsible. The other thing is, we've grown up with the assumption that this is an ATC problem and only ATC can fix it. Now, 40 years ago when I started, I agreed with that because there really wasn't the data, the computational power, the communication capability to make this a reality. Well, that all changed in the mid to late 90s. And since then, we've had the ability to fundamentally rethink the airline day of production so that you don't have these overloads. I mean, it makes zero sense for an airline to have an airplane go fast en route, burning extra fuel, take up a landing slot at the destination airport that somebody could use more efficiently, and then sit on the ramp for 45 minutes waiting for a gate. And a classic example, I was going actually to Heathrow, and I got off late, and after working with my dispatch, I found out that if I landed at 7:50 in the morning, I would misconnect about 50 passengers. But if I could land at 7:30 in the morning, I could make all those 49 of those 50 passengers. I still missed one, but I got 49 of them. Well, I worked it all out. I thought I did anyway. I went fast, and I had the fuel that day to burn a little more. But I landed and then waited 45 minutes for a gate. So the whole package has to be married in real time. You have to do this over and over and over again. So it's not just the movement of the airplane, although that's the critical first step, but it's the gate availability, it's the maintenance requirements, the crew legality. All of these things have to be taken into account moving forward. Now, only the airline can do that part, right? The ATC system could set this up and basically do it in such a way that said, okay, we're going to put this in place. If you, Mr. Airline, would like to provide us your information on when you want to land, we'll fit you into the queue 3 to 4 hours out and make it a much smoother operation. And if you choose not to give us that information, which would be silly, but that's their choice, then the ATC will just leave them where they were. So the whole system would get slightly better by just ATC implementing this, as opposed to the airline. But a implementation where the airline decides when it wants individual aircraft to land, coordinating that with air traffic control in terms of the demand and capacity, sending the message to the pilot for execution to make it a reality. But what we have today is, if this is viewed as a complete air traffic control problem, now you have a much, much more complex problem, because you have to build very sophisticated analysis systems and software for trajectory, understanding what the airplane's going to do. This will get into air traffic control, then telling the individual controller, tell me to speed up, slow down, when to take off, when to land. To be honest, I don't think it's actually possible. But that being said, it would end up being highly inefficient, because you would not have the right aircraft at the right place at the right time. You could lower congestion in the terminal airspace, but you wouldn't do it very efficiently moving forward. So the combination of the two, where the airlines basically say, let me back this up here, basically decide how the best way to manage their $300 million capital asset and then coordinate it with air traffic control. But see, what you described is it can't be done, right? Even though we've done it, we have the tools to do it. There's many people who believe that at the end of the day, there's just no way that this can be done. I've gotten emails from airline people. Well, you can't just speed up. Well, actually you can. There's rules and you have to follow the rules, but that's no problem to do that. I used to fly over the Atlantic, which is a fixed Mach. In other words, you have to have a fixed speed going across the Atlantic that you filed with air traffic control, and they approved it. Well, people would tell me, well, you just can't speed up. And I say, yeah, you're right. I have to ask them, air traffic control, if I want to go from 450 miles an hour to 500 miles an hour, I have to have the fuel to do it, obviously, and then turn around, and they 95% of the time approved it. It's just that, yes, you can't just do it willy-nilly, but you can do it with permission from air traffic control to keep the whole system moving smoothly. And I also get, well, if you're going to speed up en route, you're creating more CO2. That's true, but speeding up 2 airplanes at the front of a queue to save 60 minutes of flying time is a very good trade-off, right? And what you're doing is getting rid of a lot of low altitude maneuvering, which is more expensive, more noisy, and more polluting.
Michael, just one last thing before I let you go, if I may. I suppose rather naively, I thought that this notion of slots, which we hear so much about in relation to the aviation industry, actually did control the time at which planes arrive. Am I just misunderstanding the whole notion of a slot?
Yeah, slots, at least here in the United States, and I think Heathrow and Frankfurt are the same way, are schedule items. I can't schedule more than 35 or 6 airplanes into Heathrow an hour. Now, that's great, but we all know from this slide, let me go back and find it here.
So, sorry, just to be clear, Michael, is the slot a number of hour-long slots in which a particular airline can land planes at an airport? Is that what a slot is?
My understanding, yes. Again, I'm not a Heathrow expert, but I believe that, and it may be broken down into 15-minute segments or 30-minute segments. So,
but there's no penalty if you miss your 15-minute segment then?
No, because, well, stuff happens, right? I mean, that's, if there is, I don't care how good a system you have, there'll still be days where it's snowing in Heathrow or Chicago, right?
Or a passenger's late, or you have to offload baggage.
Yeah.
I understand all of that. But
right.
In other words, what you're saying is there's no financial incentive. There's no pain in being late for your slot. You're not penalized for that. As
far as I know, the only penalty is, I think it's Rule 262. It's that, if you're later than 3 hours, that you have to pay your passengers. It's a Eurocontrol type of penalty. So
it's not much of a penalty, is it?
Well, it's pretty expensive. It can be a couple $100,000 per flight, which is
right.
more than some of the revenue that you're going to produce, right? But it's like the fuel tax or the carbon tax. I don't believe in a carbon tax. I just want to fix it, right? Let's get to the minimum amount of fuel necessary to get to A to B efficiently. And if we did that, we'd significantly reduce carbon. Now, that would give us the time to get to those more sophisticated, more technological solutions like biofuels and better engines and other things that are, again, 10 years and $100 billion into the future.
Michael, thank you very much. It just seems to me that there isn't a sufficient financial penalty for the inefficiency and the poor management of these flight systems to encourage the change to be made.
Well, there's no visible penalty, right? Yeah. Individual airlines like United or American, and I'm sure British Airways are in the same category, although I've never done an analysis. The inefficiency in their system costs them about over $3 billion a year, which half is recoverable. right? So that's a huge penalty, but it's, it's like the old adage of, if you put a frog in cold water and slowly boil, it's happy, right? Well, this has been happening over 40 years. So
Yes.
it's now accepted as the cost of doing business. So there is a huge penalty. It's just not identified. And I've got the analysis, that if anybody's interested, I'll be glad to send them to send it to them in terms of the actual cost of this inefficiency. Like another example, United Airlines, after I kind of convinced them to do this in 1995, did an analysis of inefficiency within the system. At the time, they thought it was air traffic control, and to be honest, I did too. I've subsequently come to believe that it's not. It's just this variation that we allow to infect our day of operations day in and day out. But their analysis showed $670 million of direct operating costs. That's fuel, crews, maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. But more importantly is the lost opportunity cost. In other words, if you're flying from A to B 20 minutes longer than necessary, there's a direct operating cost of all those things, right? That's the 673 million or whatever it was. But the lost opportunity cost of not flying B to C for that 20 minutes that you're paying for is about twice as much. So it was about $1.3 billion. So in 1995, both United and American said their inefficiency cost was $2 billion a year. But if you believe it, there's nothing that can be done. It's, if that was true, we wouldn't have light bulbs and lots of other things in our lives that, people said, well, I can do this. Well, the end result is we can do this. We can make a huge dent in the CO2 noise and congestion and airlines and efficiency costs very, very quickly going forward.
But even where you've got examples of airports and presumably airlines who have done this, they still haven't rolled it out across other destinations.
No. In fact, some of the airlines we're operating with shut it down because internal to an airline, this helps everything, right? This is across the board benefit. More passengers get to the destination curb on time. The fuel costs go down. The labor costs go down. The maintenance costs go down. The number of aircraft needed go down, or you have more capacity to fly. So there is no one person that benefits directly from this. So if I'm a department manager and it's coming out of my budget and I'm not getting a significant benefit in terms that I can show that my internal costs in my department go down, why am I spending money? Especially if you believe, which most people do, is that the government's going to fix this, right? ATC is going to fix this and going forward. Well, 40 years.
It's always struck me, Michael, that the other side of that argument, ATC will fix this, is it's all ATC's fault. It's the classic fault shuffling exercise, isn't it? That you no longer would get away with in a manufacturing organization, but you do in a service organization like this.
Well, and it's like I said, 40 years ago, it pretty much was air traffic control was the only game in town to provide a solution. You taken that assumption and you carried in today. It's the old adage that Mark Twain, a very famous writer here, Tom Sawyer, et cetera, said way back, is that it's not what you know with certainty that gets you in trouble. It's what you know that just isn't true. So we know that ATC has to fix this. That's not true. Yeah. We know that only ATC can fix this. Again, that's not true. We know that weather and other elements will prevent this from happening. Well, weather is 5 to 10% of your operation. And like I said, in April of this year, 2020, you had 4,000 flights into, that's 20% of the normal, and you still didn't have.
You still couldn't get it right.
Couldn't get it right. So there's underlying issue here. In fact, my partner did an analysis of all the flights in the United States by city pairs. So the Seattle to Denver, they would look at all the flights, calculate the flight time on every one of those flights over a year, and then look at it and say, okay, what's the minimum flight time somebody flew from A to B? You know, take the bottom 5% of those flights and say, okay, that's the minimum time from A to B. Up until the pandemic, the extra flight time was over 20 minutes from A to B, above and beyond the minimum. Now, during the pandemic, that's gone down to about 12 minutes, right? Didn't go to zero. So there is some institutionalized problem underlying these delays, congestion, noise, CO2, et cetera, and cost. And this chart right in front of you is exactly the problem. It's the variation that eats you alive, both air traffic control, airlines, and passengers.
Michael, there's a lot of food for thought there. I hope people who watch this will go away and ask the questions and challenge the airlines to do better. But if I could say a big thank you for your time, and if you just want to switch us back to that last slide of yours with your contact details.
Oh, there you go.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for your time. We'll let that just sit there for a minute or two at the end of the video, but a really big thank you for taking the time tonight to share your thinking about this this chronic waste which seems to be in the system. It's very interesting to hear how the airlines would explain why it is that there's nothing they can do when Michael has made so clear that indeed they could do something about this.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to chat and again, give this perspective that there is a solution and it can be put in place in months very inexpensively and easily.
Thanks very much indeed, Michael.